Did it hit? Hold on. There we go. It started. Okay. All right, here we go. Thank you everyone for joining. We have a lot of the Freight Advisory Commission members on today. Again, this is a Freight Advisory Committee meeting only. So you're not joined with the stack today. Okay. Again, we have the usual suspects on the line today. We have Eric, who is our project manager from DOT. We have the full project team from Kittleson and Associates. We have Michael Baker International, who has been focusing on the freight plan. They're on the line today. And of course, Huddle and Northern Economics and Support. We have a big agenda today. Brian is going to go through an overview of the freight plan. We're going to talk about the trends and some interview results that the team learned through the data collection phase. We're going to go over an overview of you're going to hear people talk about the PHFS, the primary highway freight system. And then we're going to start getting into talking about priority freight corridors. I think that's as far as we're going to get today. We have another meeting scheduled in October. So I think the draft freight action strategies are going to be talked about in that follow-up meeting. Okay, so those are the things we're going to talk about today. Just to remind you about this process, we go through this at every meeting, but I think it's important. Starting in January up till now, the team has been in the data collection and analysis phase. Transportation assessment, the freight assessment, and the financial analysis technical memo. The financial memo is in the process of being updated based on all the feedback we received. So we're still kind of hovering and finishing up that data collection analysis phase as we move into the strategic direction phase of the plan. And that's where we're going to start with this group today, in the strategic direction phase. So we're here, right? Vision, goals, and performance measures. We're going to finalize that technical memo later this fall, but that's what we're starting to talk about now for the freight plan, is developing the vision and goals so that we're prepared for scenario planning. Okay. All right, now I'm going to pass it over to Brian Funkhauser with Michael Baker, and he's going to start talking through the freight plan. We have time set aside in the presentation for discussion, so prepared to do that. Okay. All right, go ahead, Brian.
Okay, and thank you, Holly, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be back with you again to be talking about Alaskan freight. And just to begin with an overview of the freight plan and a reminder that the freight plan is subordinate to the overall long-range transportation plan. And the two plans will share the same vision and goals as part of implementation, but obviously the action strategies are going to be different for both plans. So the freight actions are going to be tying into the overall LRTP goals in order to promote the safe and efficient movement of freight throughout Alaska. The flow chart you see on the screen there in front of you just shows at a very high level, the major steps, the major tasks that our team has been involved in updating the statewide freight plan, including the data collection work that we've done. We've done stakeholder engagement in recent weeks in really reaching out and providing or obtaining, I should say, more of that anecdotal type information that we're not going to get from a spreadsheet or through the census or from other online data sources. So as Holly indicated, we're at a place right now where we are in the process of developing a recommended set of strategic freight actions. And again, those are going to be organized based on the goal statements that will be flowing out of the long-range transportation plan. We're also going to be talking today to a good extent with regard to priority freight corridors. And there's some opportunities that are out there in front of us that we need to engage you as a member of the Freight Advisory Committee on providing some guidance to the DOT with regard to designation of priority freight corridors throughout the state. There's also work coming up on scenario planning and network evaluations, and that ultimately is going to lead to the development of an action plan and a freight investment plan. The freight plan is project oriented. There will be projects that will flow out of the freight plan, and they will be captured as part of the FIP, and we'll be working very closely with the DOT and the Federal Highway Administration in putting that together. Just moving on then, I want to get into the freight interview findings and trends. And I know many of you were involved in reviewing the freight assessment memo that we put together several weeks ago. And again, as we conducted the stakeholder interviews, there's certainly no shortage of trends and issues facing Alaska's freight transportation. So there are a number of driving forces that are affecting freight throughout the state. Some of them are beyond our control. Many of them are within our control. And so in reviewing these issues this evening, we do so in the context of considering how they are ultimately going to be driving the identification of strategic directions as well as projects. And as Holly indicated, we're going to be talking more about those strategic directions at a future meeting. I think we're going to be getting together in 2 weeks to review those strategic directions in more detail. So really the interview findings that we're presenting this evening really amplify the data that you saw summarized in the freight assessment memo. Just moving on to the next slide there, Holly. Some of the other key freight issues and challenges facing Alaska. I think the importance of aviation really can't be understated. Looking at the Alaska International Airport System, Ted Stevens, #2 in the nation in total landed cargo weight. Looking at the rural airports across the state, when you consider the fact that 82% of all of Alaska's communities are really not connected by a contiguous roadway network, really means that aviation is an economic lifeline to Alaska. And again, its importance can't be understated. Our stakeholders also talk to us about physical barriers to operations and efficiency. And I think a key element of the freight plan needs to be in breaking open those bottlenecks that diminish the safe and efficient movement of freight. Stakeholders also spoke of the separation between freight and other modes and some of the challenges with sharing transportation assets for freight as well as passenger vehicles and even bicycle pedestrian traffic on some of these freight routes. The next slide here speaks of collaboration opportunities for freight transportation. I think we all recognize that the DOT cannot implement the freight plan by itself. It's not going to be able to do it on its own, but it is going to require close collaboration with many partners, both at the federal level, at the regional level with the MPOs, the boroughs, sister state agencies, as well as the private sector. So I believe there are a number of opportunities there for collaboration for freight planning and freight plan implementation. One of the things that stakeholders really spoke out in favor of were these existing meetings that are being spearheaded by the DOT. They cited the Haul Road Safety meetings and the MPO quarterly meetings as events that are very effective and very productive in facilitating ongoing collaboration across the state. Other trends and forecasts that came out not only through the freight assessment memo, but also through our stakeholder interviews are the ones that you see here on the screen. Resiliency. Stakeholders really stressed a strong desire for the freight plan to consider how we're addressing climate change and things like man-made disruptions to the system. So how resilient is our system to things like flooding or mudslides, bridge strikes, things of that nature. The last bullet, establishing funding strategies beyond federal reauthorization. Through our interviews, stakeholders really encouraged exploration of new funding strategies, beyond reauthorization. What can we do to help ourselves? What can we do to improve the amount of revenue that we have available to spend on freight transportation? And let's look beyond reauthorization, or looking beyond help from Washington in providing that additional revenue. I, for one, was really surprised to see what Alaska's gas tax was. 8 cents a gallon. It's like 8 or 9 cents a gallon. 8 cents. And it hasn't been updated since Nixon was president. So again, I think as we look at different funding strategies, there's some opportunities there to see what can we do to help ourselves at a state level in providing additional revenue above and beyond whatever we receive through federal reauthorization. There are many trends that are affecting freight transportation in Alaska. And if you're at all familiar with how the drafts are coming together for the LRTP, as well as the freight plan, see a lot of the same trends that are affecting both freight planning as well as transportation in general. But the trends that you see here are going to be rolling over into driving factors, and we're going to be discussing those with you in more detail at a later meeting. From here, we want to move into, I mentioned an opportunity that we have in front of us with regard to redesignation of the primary highway freight system, or the PHFS. There was recent notice that just came out in the Federal Register that the federal government is going to be expanding the size of the PHFS. And so they're looking to all of the states to really re-examine and reevaluate their share of this national highway freight network. And so as part of that, we're going to be coordinating and collaborating with you as members of the Freight Advisory Committee in making some recommendations for the DOT's consideration in going back to Federal Highway Administration with a recommendation. Just by way of background, the primary highway freight system is a creation of the FAST Act. It was created when the FAST Act was passed back in December of 2015. And the feds have defined this as the most critical highway portions of the national freight transportation system. And it's really the priority roadway network, or the backbone of the larger national highway freight network. And I know as a DOT, as MPOs, we've been in the business of classifying roadways dating back to the 1960s. And priority freight networks is just a way for us to spatially identify what are the most important roadways to us for the movement of freight. And so that's really the opportunity in front of us. When we think about what's at stake, we look at this announcement that just came out in the Federal Register. We knew prior to that the FAST Act requires the Federal Highway Administration to redesignate this network every 5 years. From the word that came out of the Federal Register, they are giving all of the states until October 25th, just a little over a month away. We have until October 25th to come back with a recommendation from Alaska on any changes or modifications that we would like to see made to this priority network. You'll see from the slide here that Alaska's apportionment of the NHFP, or the National Highway Freight Program funding, is roughly $19 million a year. Now, I know this is a drop in the bucket compared to the overall program, but I think we need to look at that as welcome added business. This is additional revenue that's available to Alaska. And that revenue can be expanded through additional priority roadway segments that are designated either through the PHFS or through that last bullet there, the critical urban freight corridors or critical rural freight corridors. So again, as we designate additional mileage to this network, it doesn't mean that the state is going to be receiving more money, but it simply means that Alaska will have more funding options available across the larger system. That's the benefit. The next slide just shows the structure of the National Multimodal Freight Network. You'll recall during the MAP 21 era, MAP 21 had created a priority network called the Primary Freight Network, or the PFN. The FAST Act really blew that up and really expanded that to be truly multimodal. So you see in that top box there, the National Multimodal Freight Network, which is supported by a multimodal network of ports, rail, and roadways. The middle box there represents the National Highway Freight Network, that overarching priority network of most strategic importance to the movement of freight. The National Highway Freight Network, in turn, is supported by 4 subsystems. We've talked about the PHFS, highlighted here on this slide. There are also non-PHFS interstates, and to my knowledge, there are none of those in Alaska. And then the other 2 boxes speak to the critical rural and critical urban freight corridors. When we look at these 2 components or subsystems of the network, we have to look at the rural and urban freight corridors as the first and last mile connectors. These are the first and last mile connectors that provide connections to our major shippers and receivers and connect those to the larger National Highway Freight Network. Okay, so from here, we wanted to show you what the Federal Highway recognizes today as part of the PHFS, Alaska's share of the PHFS. And you can see from the map on the left that it's largely the interstates connecting Anchorage and Fairbanks and Tok. The PHFS in Alaska represents over 1,200 miles of priority freight roadway. On the right-hand side of the slide, we have a larger scale map of Anchorage and Fairbanks. And you can see that beyond the interstates, there are additional roadways that have been designated as part of the PHFS. Beginning with Anchorage up top, you see a number of roadways that have been designated over and above the interstates, the Seward Highway, the Walter Hickel Parkway, International Airport Road, and you see a little stub there on the northern piece there. That's North A Street up to the Port of Alaska. And you'll see a stub there off to the left, International Airport Road going to the airport. And then looking at Fairbanks, again, looking at the roadways over and above the interstates, we see University Avenue, as well as Airport Way, moving east to west through the city, and the Johansson Expressway. Okay, again, this is what FHWA calls the PHFS in Alaska. It's these routes that you see here on the screen. Okay. What are the critical urban and critical urban and critical rural freight corridors? And again, these are the first and last mile connections. I remember years ago, during the Ice-T era, there was a movement by Federal Highway working with the MPOs to designate intermodal connectors. If some of you will remember that, we were connecting the major intermodal facilities with the larger national interstate network. And this is kind of similar, but again, we're looking at public roads that are connecting the major shippers and receivers to the larger roadway network. And when we think about critical rural, critical urban freight corridors, these are state-owned facilities. They can also be locally owned facilities that connect those shippers and receivers to the larger, more strategic roadway network. each state has its own allotment of mileage, and the Federal Highway Administration has provided Alaska with its own allotment of critical rural and critical urban freight corridors. On the urban side, Alaska has been allotted a budget of 122 miles to be designated. 122 miles. And on the rural side, our allotment is 244 miles. Okay, so remember those numbers, 122 and 244. We'll move on then to the next slide to see what we actually have in place today. These are the critical urban and rural freight corridors that have been certified by FHWA for Alaska. And you can see from the list here, Alaska is living beneath its privileges when it comes to priority freight networks that have been designated. Currently, we have fewer than 15 miles that have been certified as critical urban freight corridors, and we only have 235 miles that have been certified as critical rural freight corridors. So again, I think when we look at a table like this, it really represents a lost opportunity. And I think currently, as we look at modifying Alaska's share of the National Highway Freight Network, we have an opportunity here on two fronts. Number one, to make recommendations on the expansion of the PHFS. And in looking at a table like this, we also have options for increasing our mileage for the urban and rural freight corridors. And again, the more immediate need is the PHFS because the feds are looking for our response by October 25th. I think with the designation of the urban and rural freight corridors, that can be done on a rolling basis. But again, the more immediate need is going back to the feds with our recommendation for changes to Alaska's share of the PHFS. So we are going to be working with the department as well as with you. That's one of the primary reasons why we're getting together here this afternoon to have a discussion about these priority roadway segments and what they should look like coming out of the freight plan and what our recommendation should be to back to the Federal Highway Administration for these priority freight networks. As the DOT prepares its response to Federal Highway Administration, they are going to be looking for some kind of letter of support, either from or on behalf of the Freight Advisory Committee. So we're going to stop right there. Or Wendy, do we want to keep going? I didn't know if we wanted to have discussion here at this point or if we need to just keep moving forward with a discussion on the priority freight corridors.
That was a lot, and I suspect people have some questions. So let's take a quick pause. We've got most of this presentation we're hoping to hear from you. So Holly, if you want to start calling on people, see if we have some initial questions, and then we can move forward a little bit.
Okay. I guess, does anybody have any questions about what you've heard so far? Brian was great about, alerting you to where there are things where we might want input. We'll start with Robert. Go ahead, Robert.
The shy one. Thanks. It was a lot of information. I don't see Southeast really emphasized a lot in the critical corridor discussion. I think that while the Haines Highway was mentioned in the 2016 plan, I want to make sure that is featured there, as well as the Port of Haines, because that is the incoming facility in which the highway provides its critical corridor. So if we could have that highlighted a little bit better and mentioned, that would be appreciated.
Thanks. Brian, do you want to talk about why things might not be on the list? Like places in the Southeast or places in Anchorage, or
I mean, you'll
maybe
notice
it's more complex than that single question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I noticed that all of the urban freight corridors are centered on Fairbanks. And so, again, you look at a list like this, you would expect to find priority roadway networks for Anchorage or other areas throughout the state. So again, I think we need to be looking at those urban areas first, I think, in really identifying some additional candidates.
Yeah, so to be clear, these aren't recommendations from the project team. This is what Federal Highways has right now. So Robert, your discussion is perfect. What's missing? What are the priorities? So that's exactly what we're looking for.
Okay, go ahead, Joe.
Not to put Mr. Craig Lyons on the spot, but how much does the MPOs have a say on if one of their roads suddenly gets designated a freight corridor or a critical urban freight corridor? Just Craig, you don't have to weigh in, but I just, was there a time when, some corridors were put on thing for critical urban freight corridors? Or I guess how much does the MPO Anchorage AMATs have to say about it?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that the MPO doesn't have any routes. The state has routes and the municipality has routes, and they're the two partners in the MPO. So, AMATs in our freight study can look at and suggest what might be a good freight route, but it's up to the owners of those facilities to decide it. So I guess our role would be to offer suggestions on what might be the right ones, but again, it's up to them. Does that help? Or
Yeah, I just wanted to see where that played into it. If us at this level here just declare a road a freight thing, and if suddenly the Anchorage or AMAT, the Anchorage municipality would be at odds with certain determinations.
Okay.
So what this group can do is make recommendations. We have a robust discussion. We're going to take all of those back to DOT, kind of talk through them, see where we need to go, and then come back and report to you at the next meeting.
I think it would be fair too for the MPOs to make recommendations as well. In other states, I've seen a very collaborative process where the DOT worked in partnership with the MPOs in engaging them and learning more about their priorities at a regional level. No guarantees, obviously, in terms of how things were going to work out, but there's certainly a difference between a roadway being designated versus ultimately being certified by FHWA. So I think it'd be great for the MPOs to be a part of this process.
Go ahead, Aves.
In looking at this, if you're looking for recommendations for urban freight corridors, I would suggest that we look within the municipality of Anchorage at places like the Seward Highway, the Glen Highway, Tudor Road, Port of Alaska, because those are indeed critical urban freight corridors. I note that in the Fairbanks area, they talk about Steese Highway, Old Richardson, Pegger Road. Those are critical to them. And the ones I mentioned are critical to the Anchorage area.
Thank you. Okay, anybody else who hasn't had a chance to speak yet or ask a question? Anybody else before we move on? Okay, I'm going to move us along. You ready, Wendy?
Just one quick thing. Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about the PHFS and the Dalton Highway? Because we kind of focused on the urban and rural corridors, but we kind of skipped over the PHFF discussion.
Yeah, I think there was a proposal, I guess, to propose the Dalton Highway as a candidate for the PHFS. I think part of it already has been designated as part of a critical rural freight corridor. I know there were questions over whether or not a dirt road would qualify for placement on the PHFS. I have not seen anything in the guidance that would preclude a dirt road being on the PHFS. Probably wouldn't see that in other states, but certainly the Dalton Road is would be an exception. But it is something we have requested more information from FHWA on. I'm still waiting to hear back from them on that question.
So are there any reactions or feedback to the Dalton Highway, having a portion of that designated as the PHFS to allow more funding to go that way?
Go ahead, Joe.
To clarify, how much, there's 235 miles of urban, in that previous slide, that 235, what does that encompass of the Dalton Highway?
So
Yeah.
0 to 235, okay.
I think maybe if you can just refresh on the difference between the critical urban and critical rural corridors and the PHFS.
Sure. The critical rural and critical urban freight corridors are designated based on their location within or outside of an urbanized area. So again, from the table here, you can see that even though our allotment of the critical rural freight corridor allotment is 244 miles, we're short on that side. We're incredibly short on the urban side, looking at we have 122 miles that we're eligible for. We can designate 122 miles worth of roadway as a critical urban freight corridor, and we're at less than 15.
So then, knowing that the Dalton Highway isn't part of the PHFS, how is that different than what you just described?
The PHF, I think the issue here is that the Dalton Highway is consuming, all of or majority of the critical rural freight corridor mileage that's available to the state. So I think a consideration here would be if the state would be successful in getting the Dalton Highway designated as part of the PHFS, it could free up additional mileage in other rural areas for first and last mile connections. I think that is the opportunity.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Yes, this is Bruce Lambert with Mirad. I just want to clarify something. We're really talking about eligibility. We're not talking about, an automatic money going to this. So even if the Dalton Highway is designated, then it just becomes eligible for these funds. But ultimately, the project still has to, satisfy other requirements that the DOT has. So when you're talking about these programs, just be very clear, you're talking about eligibility for funds. You're not talking about actual appropriated and allocated funds.
That is correct. Again, it gives the department additional options, another bucket of funding that would be available for that particular roadway segment. So if you have a project that touches, the Seward Highway, for example, it would be eligible for National Highway money from the National Highway Freight Program.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, just to provide a little clarification here. In our dealing with federal highways on the critical rural freight corridors, I think it's well understood that we'd like to have the entire length of the Dalton Highway in the system, but they're constrained by Congress in terms of the length of miles. However, I think as Brian pointed out, the real purpose here is eligibility for NHFN funding. So we do, Federal Highways has afforded us some flexibility to undesignate and redesignate particular routes depending on our need, to provide that funding to the project. So consider that Dalton Highway designation loose and flexible. We can make changes or make an amendment to the freight plan to move that mileage to another route if we need to. I think the other thing is in terms of expectations of this Federal Register notice. From my reading on it, there is a very limited ability or even a desire to play with adding, lots of mileage to the PHFS. Dalton, because some of it is unpaved, is questionable. They're really looking at interstate highway system routes and things that are critical to moving, freight around. And we look at the Dalton and we go, well, it's critical to us. But I think in terms of the national system, it tends to be problematic. Just because of the nature of the highway construction. I guess the other thing I see in the Federal Register notice is they're really looking to confirm. They're seeing what's nationally, what has changed in the interstate highway system over the last 5 years. Have there been new routes, brought up to speed? And so that's one option they have. The other option they're looking at is taking states like ours and saying, how do we take this extra mileage we have, which I think after they do all the scrubbing is something like 960, somewhere in there, over the existing total, and spreading that out, in which case states like Alaska would get like 53 additional PHFS miles. So we're not talking a lot. So I just thought I'd say that. You'll probably want to read through the Federal Register notice. See if you.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, one last hand up is Rich, and then we'll move on. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, I know, I think Abe's already mentioned this or talked about it, but so am I to understand that the only critical urban listing is stuff for it in the Fairbanks area, and there isn't any in the rest of the state currently?
Correct.
That does seem like quite an oversight. Okay.
Or an opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Rich. Okay, you ready to move on, Brian?
Can I just add something to Eric's comments? Yeah, great comments from Eric. And I think nationwide, the overall network is anticipated to expand by around 3%. But I did see from other things I've been looking at that we may be looking at an expansion of roughly 50 miles in Alaska. I wanted to add too, when you look at the criteria for or recommended criteria for designating critical rural, critical urban freight corridors, one of them deals with energy exploration and energy extraction. So I think as that relates to the Dalton Highway, we'll have to again coordinate with FHWA and others on what their thoughts would be on a potential redesignation of the PHFS that would include the Dalton Highway.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on then to the next section of our meeting, which addresses priority freight corridors. And so this is an important distinction that we're moving into here. This is not we're moving away from federal designations here and more on a state designation. And again, we're looking at priority freight corridors more from the standpoint of planning and programming as a tool for prioritizing projects on the STIP. And again, if you have a project in the future that touches the network, that it would receive a higher priority compared to one that does not. We do have a map that shows the previously identified freight corridors. This slide just shows those priority freight corridors, and this is a screenshot that was taken from the 2016 freight plan. I think it's important to remember that the priority freight corridors were intended to be dynamic, very fluid, something that's going to be subject to change, that we can add or modify this priority network over time. And you'll see from the priority network here that it's composed of 6 different components, very multimodal in nature, including highways, the Alaska Railroad, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the AMHS, and seaports and airports all across the state. There's several leading roadway corridors, may not be visible in a statewide graphic like this, but they do include the Dalton Highway, other highways like the Seward Highway, Sterling, Steese, Richardson, Parks Highway, and others. Looking down at more of a local level, you can go ahead, Holly, on that next slide. The MPOs also designated priority corridors as part of their freight mobility plans. And this is a map of the Fairbanks area. And you can see from the bullet list here that the roadway segments that were identified, you'll notice in the bold print, these are roadways that were not in the 2016 plan. I'll just give you a moment or two to get familiarized with those roadway segments. Likewise, in Anchorage, the next slide shows previously identified priority freight corridors within Anchorage. And there may be opportunities here to start shopping for additions to the PHFS. But again, these are previously identified priority freight corridors. And again, as with Fairbanks, the roads shown in bold print were not in the previous plan.
In the previous long-range transportation plan, correct?
Yes, thank you for clarifying.
Okay.
Okay. Other freight corridors that were identified for consideration, and these came out of the stakeholder interviews that we conducted earlier this summer. And again, these are corridors that have a higher share of truck volumes, as well as a greater share of overall truck traffic. Okay.
Okay, so I think what you want to do now, Brian, is you want feedback on these, well, the full lists, I guess, right? But basically what you're saying here with these slides are, these are likely the priority freight corridors that this 2050 long range, Alaska State Long Range Transportation Plan, freight plan, will make in the freight plan. Is that correct? And you want some feedback and discussion and initial reaction on those items, right?
Yeah, maybe if we could camp out for, on each one of these slides here and have some more discussion on each one. But you're right, we want to come away with a recommendation from this group on roadways that should be added as part of the statewide priority freight corridor network. And again, it would also be a great starting point for us in making any recommendations to Federal Highway Administration for candidates for the PHFS or urban and rural freight corridors, whatever the case may be.
And
So why don't we?
Yeah, start here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we had, okay, Rich, I saw you had your hand up. We had one initial reaction of course, from Robert, again, the Port of Haines should be added for southeast, straight shot to Fairbanks in the interior. Okay, so that's, go ahead.
Yeah, and before Rich goes, I just want to also say, are there airports that maybe aren't priority freight? We're calling them corridors. Obviously, I guess you could call a runway a corridor, but are there airports that maybe should be added or that should come off the list? So we want to look at this comprehensively. And I realize this is a lot of information. So if we start with the discussion today, you can go back, take a look at it, and then we can also talk about it at our next meeting. Go ahead, Rich.
I actually don't have anything for this slide. It's for one of the next two, actually. You guys went back on me.
Okay,
It was,
well, go ahead. Why don't you start?
oh, I noticed that you listed the Palmer-Wasilla Highway and the Glen Highway is listed on the Anchorage one, but does that include the Glen portion of the Glen Highway going through the main corridor through Wasilla?
Good question.
Because I would say that's a very much a priority freight corridor.
Okay, which team member wants to answer that question? So is this the slide you're talking about here, right, Rich?
Yeah, so the Glen Highway coming is listed for the Anchorage one, but I'm the entire corridor going from the Glen Highway through Eagle River and through Wasilla. I'm sure Jimmy coming on trying to get stuff through Wasilla and further north through there. So that entire section should be listed, not just listed with Anchorage.
Right. So the reason that it's listed just with Anchorage is because of the AMAT's boundary. So the Anchorage ones are just going to list what's within the municipality of Anchorage boundaries. Same with Fairbanks. So that's where we need to make sure, like you said, we capture that Glen Highway outside of those jurisdictional boundaries. And it is the Parks Highway that goes through Wasilla. You're right, Mark. But also with the Mat-Su borough looking at, or the Mat-Su area, Palmer-Wasilla looking at forming an MPO, they'll start to capture some of that. So we do want to make sure that the Glen Highway is captured on our PHFS or our critical rural corridors.
Right, and as well as the section of it that goes through Eagle River.
Yes. Yep.
Which I know falls in the municipality of Anchorage, but I just want to make sure that that entire section is covered.
Correct.
Okay. Back here. So remember, this is the 2016 statewide long-range transportation plan and freight plan. That's what you're looking at here. Okay. Go ahead, Aves.
Yes, could you go back to that Anchorage AMAT's map, this one? I see that there are the green lines are key freight highway facilities. Are those designated on the, what is it, the primary or the freight network, the national freight network?
So based on my recollection of the map, I believe that some are and some are not. But I'm going to let one of the experts answer that completely.
So they're not on the critical urban freight corridors. So there's an opportunity to designate those.
Well, yes, and that goes to my earlier point. That there are a number of critical urban freight corridors that that probably should be at least candidates for the list.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lee, do you have any comments on aviation?
Yeah, could you go back to the slide with the airports on it, please? I think in general you have a handful of the one, you have most of the 139 airports on there, which definitely are critical. This is sort of a pipe dream comment that I'm coming up with here as well. But with a comment somebody made earlier, I can't remember who it was, maybe Eric or somebody, but you were talking about 82% of the communities only accessible by air. When it comes to potentially a subset of airports. When I think of critical freight, there's nothing more critical than only one way to access a community. And when I think of the rural communities, any community that's not accessible by a waterway or a highway or a road or a trail, therefore becomes fairly critical in the air network for freight transportation. You could get into essential air service, bypass mail, kind of the federal sort of subsidized scenario, or what may be viewed as a subsidy. And a lot of that goes to communities that don't have road access. So when I think of a map and think of critical freight corridors via a highway or an air highway or a marine highway, they're all the same. Just sometimes your transportation device never leaves the ground or the water. So it's a little bit different. But that's sort of a pipe dream that I see as anywhere that's not accessible by a second mode of transportation becomes absolutely critical, because there's only one way to transport the freight in and out at that point. But if you're looking at it from a basic perspective, you have most of the 139 approved airports. Most of them. I mean, I think there's some other, like you have Ketchikan, Sitka, missing. We have Unalaska, Cold Bay is sort of a critical one. It's a 139. But then you get out to some of the, St. Paul, St. George. That's the only way to get in or out. Or Gamble's. Well, they have waterway access too. But I think I'll stop my comment there. Pipe dream, but necessary for me to say at this point.
Valid points. Thanks. Bob, anything from military logistics standpoints that you see are missing?
I'm not really seeing anything. The key is the port for us. I didn't know if you want to designate our Fort Greely Airport, since it can be commercial use, and that's there in Delta Junction. Other than that, I didn't see anything special for the military, because we're using the rail corridor pretty much right now, and connected direct to the Port of Anchorage, Port of Alaska. So we're in pretty good shape.
Thank you.
Hey, if I could add one more comment, Lee, here. One port that may today not necessarily be a big driver, but in the very near future likely will, is Port Clarence. So it might be Point Spencer, Port Clarence might be worthwhile considering that aspect of a critical freight corridor. It's the only real natural deep water port in the Nome and Kotzebue, Utqiagvik area.
Any other modes you want to hear from, Wendy? Or Brian?
Robert, I think you've talked about Haynes. I think there's a little red line coming out of Haynes down there. I agree, it's hard to see, but the next time we'll come with a little bit better map. Part of our challenge is we had coordinates and none of it's really ever been mapped comprehensively in GIS. So our team is working on that. So we have milepost to milepost and coordinates, but it's never actually been mapped. So our next meeting we'll have a better map to depict all of this.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I guess before we move on to, well, let's do this map. I forgot about these.
So just as a reminder, these are previously identified in the MPO freight mobility plans. And again, the items in bold are things that are identified in that MPO's freight mobility plan, but were not identified in the statewide long-range transportation plan. So those are opportunities, I guess. And so we want to know what you think about that from a statewide perspective. How long should I let you sit in silent thinking?
This is Joe Michelle as a Fairbanks boy. The Fairbanks fast roads that they've identified are spot on.
Okay.
And that's a good answer, Joe. That's the kind of feedback we need. We just want to make sure we're not missing anything. So, yeah, if it looks good, let us know it looks good. Fast planning did a good job.
Okay, I guess moving on to Anchorage, but Aves, you have your hand up. Go ahead, if whether it's Anchorage or Fairbanks, whatever.
This is Anchorage. Looking at the list of potential candidates from the AMAS 2017 project, I would suggest adding Commercial Drive / 3rd Avenue. And I would also give kind of a heads up that to designate Northern Lights Boulevard, West Northern Lights Boulevard as a major freight corridor is going to be difficult at best.
Oh, Aves, I thought you were going to tell us to do that. And I was going to say, oh, no.
I think it's probably a good idea, but I'm not real sure that many people in West Anchorage along that route agree.
There's a long history there.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Anything else? Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, I would consider parts of Old Seward and O'Malley have gotten a large amount of additional truck traffic, especially as you're running from C Street into O'Malley, and that intersection in that area. A lot of additional freight and commercial volume, at least on Old Seward, not just on the new Seward Highway.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Okay.
So before we move on to, also remember, oh shoot, I keep jumping ahead, Holly. We had one more, but we'll post these slides. You can kind of mull it over for the next 2 weeks, and you'll have another chance just to weigh in quickly at our next meeting. So I'll quit butting in, Holly.
No, that's okay. I think there's enough space at this meeting to like really think this through. I think it's fine. Okay, I guess the last list. Remind me, Brian, this is what you heard from the stakeholder interviews about corridors that needed to be added for consideration, correct?
Correct. These would be over and above what we're seeing in the MPO plans, and these were roadway segments that came out of our stakeholder interviews.
I think we heard from Lee about airports so I think we've got that comment, but I guess, is there any other reaction to this list? Okay. Go ahead, Rich.
The one other at least for us, for small package would be Connect Goose Bay. The traffic on that is, we move a lot of deliveries through there, and the traffic's atrocious.
What was that name again?
Connect Goose Bay Road in Wasilla.
Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as KGB, Brian.
Yeah. Jimmy, we haven't heard anything from you. Any thoughts on that particular edition? Anything else missing?
So Aves and Joe have been hitting them pretty good. I don't remember the road to Whittier and the road to Seward. Is that on there? A lot of freight comes out of Seward and Whittier.
So when you say the road to Whittier, are you talking about the tunnel, the actual road into Whittier?
Yeah,
Okay.
once you get off the Seward Highway, and then the Seward Highway, I can't tell by the map, but I don't think it goes all the way into, I think based on the map, it looks like it stops at 38 Mile and goes towards the Sterling Highway, but I don't think it runs all the way into Seward.
We will double check those. Thank you.
Uh-huh, thank you.
This is Joe Michelle again. Just to ask the committee's indulgence real quick, I just need to clarify. So the Dalton Highway is part of the federal highway system only up until milepost 235 by Chandler. After that it is no longer on the federal highway system.
It's considered a critical rural freight corridor up to that point, the CRFC.
Okay, thank you.
This is Jimmy Doyle. In response to Joe's question, I'm going to assume that whenever they created that, I think it said it was 235 miles to Chandelar, and 244 is all we get. They must have just arbitrarily stopped there is the only thing I can think that makes sense, because otherwise it doesn't make, obviously the whole Dalton Highway should be included, but obviously the miles aren't there.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone knows why Federal Highway landed on the numbers that they did.
Eric
Yeah,
might.
each state got its own allotment.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I'm not, it's one of those combinations of land area and number of miles total in the primary system. And I can't recall exactly. The Dalton, the entire length of the Dalton is part of the national highway system. So it's still eligible for, normal national highway performance program funds. It's just we can't use the National Highway Freight Program funds except on such segments as are designated part of the critical rural freight network. And, as I said earlier, we can move that designation around as we need to have that eligibility where we're trying to make freight improvements. Now there was something else I was going to say. Well, I'll stop there if it comes back to me.
Okay, Bruce, go ahead.
I'm going to fill you in on the sad story about how we got to the 41,000 mile network. In the mid 2015s, the Bureau of Transportation Statistics put a national map together of the largest segmented routes based on the freight analysis framework. And that number was roughly, close to 40 something thousand miles. And that's where the 40 something thousand miles came from. It was based on the National Highway Planning Network submissions, the NHPMS submissions. So there was a lot of states that did not have their full network coded for various reasons on the HPMS data set. So there was a lot of gaps. For instance, I know the state of Louisiana has some of the world's longest bridges, but because of maintenance issues, they did not include them on the HPMS data submission because of the way they do asset management approaches of those bridges. So they were not on the original 41,000 miles. So back to Eric's comment, there was a lot of gaps. And the initial map really tied to the state's HPMS submission. And so that all got cleaned up. And the numbers were all determined to let each state have some rural and urban corridors to help with goods movement. Again, as was mentioned earlier, for extraction or bulk or container traffic. So realistically, the number itself was based on a map that Bureau of Transportation Statistics did, and And then the staffers used that number, and that's where the origin of the network came from. And it's separate from the StrawNet or StracNet, if you're familiar with those networks, and separate from the federal aid network, even though it's a part of it. So it really had its own origin, in that particular based off a map. So that's why your HPMS submission is critical, because that's what a federal highway uses for a lot of these route analysis and choice studies that they're doing on capabilities and things of that nature. So thank you.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I remember now what I was trying to bring out before. In the designations of the critical rural freight corridor segments, one of the requirements is that it has to connect 2 logical nodes. So you can't just designate the whole amount of the funding and have it kind of hanging out in the middle of nowhere. They want to make sure you're connecting one destination to another destination. So that's the limitation there.
This is Joe Michelle. What document established the critical urban freight corridors? Is it one of the documents that's kind of listed at the beginning of this presentation? The reason I'm asking this is if it was only about 5 years ago, I'm sure that we could find somebody. I'm just wondering if there was a reason why there wasn't an Anchorage Road included in that. I mean, it seems like such an obvious thing to do that I wonder if somebody didn't do it for a reason.
Eric, do you have any history on that, or Craig, do you have any history?
Let me try and answer on that. I think the reason is that the state is looking for input from the metropolitan area, and that would be based on their freight corridor study and the recommendations of their freight advisory committee. So, once you make that recommendation, coming to the state, then we would go ahead and represent that up to federal highways. The final designation has to come from federal highways. So that comes through our division, our Federal Highway Division office in Juneau. They usually check it out through their headquarters to make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's crossed. And then they come back and say, you're good to go.
Okay, so I guess, is there any other discussion maybe from Craig on this, or are you comfortable with? I mean, from the way I am thinking about it, it seems like the AMAT's freight mobility plan, and maybe the last time that designations were made for the critical urban and rural freight corridors didn't line up. Is that part of how things didn't get fed into the process maybe? Could that be one thing? Or maybe we'll just figure out why and report back.
Sorry, I'm muted. Going back to 2016, the AMAT's freight corridor study was still in progress. So they didn't have recommendations coming out. And I think you saw in the distinction or the difference between the 2016 Anchorage freight corridor study and the 2019, that now you have these additional corridors on there that bunch. The original bunch that aren't molded there are all part of the primary freight system. So, you look at those and go, well, there wasn't really any reason to designate them as a CUFC because they're already part of the primary freight system.
So I think what we can do is we can come back with some recommendations of, what are those those connections, those critical connections that are missing, and then talk a little bit more in depth about what can be added to those at our next meeting from this list. And Craig, we'll probably loop back with you on that.
Yeah, I think I'd say, Mr. Chair, Joe, we have an agenda item for our next quarterly meeting. That's for sure. I don't know how, yeah, I guess Eric's answer is kind of says it best. It's kind of in the middle of things and just bad timing.
So I know you were trying to move ahead before, Wendy. Maybe I'm moving it. I guess I'm moving us ahead now. Are you ready to move into the freight action strategies? And or I guess, are there any final words here?
Yeah.
From anyone? No.
So Holly, I think we only have about 15 minutes left. So I think, Brian, if you just kind of want to introduce some of the new actions. So this will just be an introduction to the freight actions, but this isn't the last time you're going to see them. We kind of knew we'd run out of time for this meeting, which is why we've already got a second meeting on your calendars. But I think it's probably good to kind of introduce these so you can see where we're headed, and then we'll kind of jump in here at our next meeting.
All right, so we'll just do a quick run through just to get you acclimated or acquainted to the proposed freight plan strategies. And again, as a starting point, we wanted to look at the existing plan strategies to see which ones were, good enough to carry forward as part of the freight plan update. So as we go through these slides real quickly here with the time that we have left, the bullets that you see, such as the one on the screen here, these are existing strategies from the current freight plan. So look at these in the context of, do these strategies still apply as part of the update? So again, the strategies have been reorganized around the goal statements that are flowing out of the long-range transportation plan. We touched on some of those earlier. So again, the bullets that you see here are carryover from the previous freight plan. And we've highlighted the new strategies here on the slides. So we'll pause between each one for discussion. But again, the ones that you saw on the previous slide were all carryover, ones that we believe are worthy of keeping as part of the plan update. Some of the new ones, the new action strategies that you see here, I'll just touch on those: raising awareness of the Port of Alaska as a critical statewide asset. That might seem like, might not seem profound, but stakeholders said that, there's quite a few people who look at the Port of Alaska, if there's issues there or problems that need to be solved, that people look at it as an Anchorage issue, when in fact it's an Alaska issue. So, geographically, obviously it's in Anchorage, but it serves the entire state. And so stakeholders said we need really to raise awareness of the Port of Alaska as a strategic freight-wide asset, or statewide asset, I'm sorry. Supporting the cooperative efforts between the Port of Alaska and the railroad as business partners. And that was really raised as an issue for our team, as a need for them to work together with regard to things like the timing of train movements, and just to ensure that access to the port isn't cut off due to a large train moving over a crossing. And then raising the awareness of the importance of air cargo movement. Again, that goes back to an earlier point on aviation being an economic lifeline. All right. And Wendy, I don't know if we want to have discussion or save that for October 6th.
I think we should probably save that for October 6th.
Okay. All right. So again, this is just a preview of coming attractions. We'll talk to this more on our meeting on October 6th.
I'm just gonna pause you for 1 second. I do have a hand up, and I'll just go ahead, Aves.
Better turn my mic on.
Yeah.
In the, just talking about the Port of Alaska, one of the things I would ask that we consider is a bullet point that would say something to the effect to enhance truck access to the Port of Alaska. For example, unattended security checkpoints.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll move you on to resiliency, Brennan.
Okay. All right, so again, you see some of the previous action items there: climate change resiliency, changing weather patterns, more rain, more clouds, affect approach patterns to our airports. New goal statements or recommended action strategies, completion of road safety audits as a low-cost, high-value item really to address safety problems on our high-priority freight corridors. And then evaluating at-grade rail crossings of state-owned assets and developing a prioritized list for their improvement. This is something that wasn't mentioned in the previous freight plan. Okay.
Go one hand up. I'm gonna go to
Oh, I'm
Joe.
sorry.
That's okay.
Yes.
Go ahead, Joe.
Would you be able just to slightly elaborate on what it means, coordinate completion of road safety audits to correct safety problems on high priority freight corridors? Is that directing DOT to actually adequately fund its commercial motor vehicle enforcement?
It could entail that, as well as looking at improvements that are needed on the ground, whether it's pavement markings or signage or roadway geometry, intersection geometry. I think it would entail all of those things.
Thank you.
So Joe, are you recommending an action that addresses enforcement and funding?
I think so, yes. I mean,
Okay. Thank you.
All right, one of the LRTP goal statements deals with Alaska people focus. And I think for the freight plan, that would address issues related to freight as a good neighbor. And so we've had discussion on the PHFS and priority freight corridors. When we look at things like that second bullet there, separating active transportation facilities along major freight corridors, we heard from stakeholders that there are issues where we have competing interests on freight corridors, and there's a need to really identify where we want freight to be, where we want the trucks to be, where we don't want them to be, and vice versa. So stakeholders did highlight the need for a greater separation of different uses, if you will, on certain freight corridors. Where do we want to encourage truck traffic? Where do we want to discourage truck traffic? Under coordination and collaboration, next slide. We have a carryover bullet point there. The first one actually was creating the statewide freight advisory committee. Obviously, it's in existence now. So this has been slightly rewritten from the 2016 version, and we are advocating to maintain that statewide freight advisory committee as an important advisory board for the department. Then a new one would be working with representatives of the forthcoming Mat-Su MPO. We have a brand new MPO that's being created as a result of the latest data from the census. And so I think there's an opportunity there for the department to work with this brand new MPO and the new officials there who are going to be responsible for standing that up and working with them on long-range planning as well as freight planning. So there's going to be an opportunity there for the department to be working with those who are involved in administering the program of this brand new MPO. There's another goal area that deals with funding. We've talked about that already tonight. And again, we talked about the need to pursue alternative funding sources and mechanisms. Talked about things like the gas tax. I mean, there's other vehicles, other ways of raising revenue for freight transportation, including public-private partnerships. So that is being proposed as a new action item for the freight plan. The next one deals with performance-based decision-making. And the new bullet points, Holly, I think are on the next slide. Very specific, reducing the percentage of interstate lane miles that are in poor condition. And the feds like to see that to a rate less than 10%, as well as reducing the overall number of poor bridges as measured by deck area.
One hand up. Go ahead, Aves.
A quick question. Do we know what those current percentages are for a poor condition of lane miles and poor condition of bridges?
We do. We have those documented. DOT does a really good job of keeping those, and those are documented in our transportation assessment. And I don't have that open right in front of me, I don't think, but we can put those in the chat.
Yeah, so it's on the website, and I'm going to ask Michelle, who's on here, to put a link to the transportation assessment on the website. If you could do that, Michelle, that would be helpful. Thanks.
Good, thank you.
It'll be on page 1,300,000. I'm just kidding. I don't know what page it'll be on, but maybe we can figure that out too.
Well, I'm so glad I can easily find it.
Okay, and then the next one is under transportation innovation. And a recommendation here to support the use of technology and improving the safety and efficiency of freight movement. And so this would entail things like getting traveler information out to truck drivers, information on truck parking availability, changing weather conditions, and things of that nature. And then the bottom one there, serve as a partner in research efforts on UASs and the potential benefits there to air cargo movement. Be a brand new freight strategy.
Go ahead, Joe.
If you would back up one slide, please. I was checking on something before I made a comment. In regards to, I fully appreciate reducing the percentage of poor condition lane miles, and I do very much appreciate reducing the number of poor bridges. But I think that there should be some distinction made on some bridges are a higher priority for the freight network than other bridges. And if you're just saying all bridges are created equal and whoever is the crappier bridge gets replaced first, that's well and all, but you know, some bridge out in the middle of nowhere that has a slightly lower rating than a bridge that half of Alaska goes across every day, there should be some sort of, not priority, but at least some acknowledgement that some bridges need to be used more frequently, even if they aren't as in poor condition as a different bridge, if that makes sense. If there's a bridge at 45% and a bridge at 50%, there should be some sort of weighting that the bridge at 50% is used 3 times as much, or modules going up north to the oil field and things of that nature. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think somewhere within the freight plan, we need to recognize the push from Federal Highway to really get the states to be moving more toward lowest life cycle cost as opposed to addressing worst first. But you bring up an important point too, in terms of making a distinction between bridges or pavements that are on a priority freight network as opposed to elsewhere. Good comment.
Okay.
All right, I think we covered those, Holly, and system management, prioritizing truck bottlenecks and addressing those truck bottlenecks. creating a centralized data repository that would inform not only long-range transportation planning, but also freight planning. A resource that could be used as one-stop shopping for not only DOT officials, but also your partners at the regional level at the MPOs. Okay, a couple more here. The establishment of a TIM team to address traffic incident management and getting incidents cleared more quickly from the roadways, disaster and incident response planning between the Port of Alaska and private sector companies that came out of our stakeholder interviews. Number 3, I think, is a no-brainer. We've talked about that a good bit here this afternoon. And then the last one there, continue to track and identify new freight corridors for addition to the system. And that's something that's going to happen sooner rather than later. But it is an ongoing process for the DOT and the Freight Advisory Committee. And again, as Wendy indicated, we'll be talking about these in more detail at our next meeting, but we wanted to give you a preview, just using the time we had remaining here today.
Okay, any final comments on on these items we just blew through? Okay, so you've had a primer. There'll be more to talk about at our next meeting. Is it 2 weeks or 3 weeks? It might be 3 weeks. 2 weeks. October 13th is the next meeting. And that's going to be, again, just this group only, just the Freight Advisory Committee. Okay. And then just very shortly after that, there'll be a stack meeting. And I know many of you are on both committees, so plan for that. Okay. I guess any final words from you, Wendy?
I just want to say, so we really have divided up the meetings to give everyone more time to talk. So we'll always plan a little bit too much for each meeting in case we move ahead more rapidly, or we'll make sure we have a follow-up meeting if we need more time to discuss things. So we'll start to keep the meetings split up. We do have one more joint meeting planned, which is to kind of do a 101 on what scenario planning is and isn't, and how we're going to move forward with that. So that'll be kind of pushing information out on that particular one. And then we'll have some follow-up meetings with each individual group for more detailed discussion. So we did hear what you had to say. I hope that you felt like you had more of an opportunity to talk this time. Encourage you to read through all of this, do your homework, so we can kind of get this finalized and move on to our next items.
Anything else?
Abe's has his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed it, Abe's. Go ahead.
Will decisions be made at the October 13th meeting about nominations for the urban freight corridor and the rural freight corridors?
Yeah, that's a good question because that's such a short timeline.
So what we're going to do is take the feedback we heard today. We're going to come up with some recommendations, talk with the DOT leadership team, and then we'll present those kind of initial recommendations back to you at the next meeting.
Cool.
All right.
Last call.
We're right at 5. That's pretty good.
I know.
So are these meetings envisioned to be 1:30 on those days? What time?
Yeah, hold on. Let me just.
We're showing 2 o'clock on the 13th.
So we will get this one on your calendar. Actually, this one is on your calendar already. Okay. Sorry, I didn't have it at my fingertips. There's like 4 groups. This one should be on your calendar already. We have this one scheduled from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Alaska time.
On the 13th?
on Wednesday, October 13th. Yep. And then those of you who are on the staff, there'll be another meeting on Thursday, October 21st from 1:30 to 3 Alaska time. And that's the stack only. Okay, those who have to jump over to the other meeting, I get it. Go, flee.
And we are trying to get these meetings calendared more in advance. It's just easier for everybody. So we're trying to get them a calendared. So you'll see more appointments coming through.
Okay. I appreciate everybody's participation today. It felt like there was more space for more thorough participation. So thanks a lot for everything.
Thanks.
Okay, have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.